Hello, it's your host, Todd Lewis. This is the AAR to a debate that Keith Preston and I had 2 weeks ago on In Defense of Empires. So I guess to start off, I'd like to ask you, Keith, where do you think your argument was maybe the weakest and where you thought maybe my side was the weakest?
Well, I think the weakest argument against empires just has to do with the argument from the strength versus weakness. Somebody who is a staunch proponent of empires will argue that ultimately the powerful are going to dominate the weak, and it's going to be those who can assemble mass armies and the related technological resources and things like that. They're going to rule the world and all of that. So yeah, that's really the classic defense of empire. If we don't rule, someone else will. That's often a lot of people try to wrap it up in ideas like benevolent hegemony and world liberation and, like Alexander the Great Hellenizing the ancient Near East or whatever. But it's ultimately just about conquest. But the real rationale behind it is, if we don't, someone else will, that kind of argument. So I think that, you could argue against that on multiple grounds. Though some people might make an ethical or moral argument. I think people who really buy into that kind of mentality, though, probably wouldn't care or be impressed with ethical or moral arguments. But I think there's also the practical argument against that. The practical argument is that, well, empires usually don't come to a very good end. I mean, name one that didn't fall apart eventually and often produce a worse society for the mother country than what they had before. So I think that's really the main issue with empire. And anybody that wants to argue against empire building, that's really the first thing they have to address. As far as arguments for empire, I think the main one there is probably the weakest argument there is that empires are somehow necessary for the development of civilization and things like that. I mean, it's because it's such a one-dimensional way of thinking. It ignores the cost of empire building. I mean, the financial cost, the cost in blood, the blowback from terrorists and rebellious colonies and provinces and things like that. I've never come across a proponent of imperialism who really took the idea seriously that seemed to have any valid refutations for that. Except to just ignore the question. Like I know that was a big issue that came along after 9/11. When some people were saying, well, this is blowback against American intervention in the Middle East and that kind of stuff. And that rather than address that issue, there were a lot of people who were proponents of American empire who just simply said, no, that has nothing to do with it. Muslims are just crazy people or whatever. So I think that's really the main issue there.
Okay. I'd like to ask you, Anarcho, what do you think the strongest and weakest arguments on our sides were from your point of view of the debate?
Well, I think one of the stronger moves from your side was to first define empire as a hegemonic military security force, usually through some sort of central state. Because I think that covers both official and unofficial empires, like even the American empire, which is an unofficial. You only hear Ron Paul and Pat Buchanan talk about the American empire in a negative sense to disparage it, but you'll never hear any president or American official talk about the empire and the progress we're trying to make with the empire and all of that sort. So I think it was good of you to define it that way. Therefore, you could distinguish between, and then later on, by the end of the debate, when you were talking about, say, the Vikings, why wasn't that just a failed empire? It was very easy of you to distinguish why the Vikings why their sense of conquest and it was not related to, or did not fit the definition you gave for empire. So I think it was good of you to do that up front. But I think the strongest argument from Keith's side was to go over the costs, because And this is where it gets a little tricky when we talk about the comparative. You know, is not having an empire worse than having one? It gets a little tricky when we're talking about lives. It's not like money where we can just come up with a number and say, you know, was it a net positive, and you know, was there more dollars after, more less? You know, even if you go through the economic prosperity and, you know, the literature and the arts which flourished afterwards, it's very difficult to say empirically or objectively that was all worth the lives that would have been lost in the establishment of an empire. And it's also very tricky when we have to distinguish, you know, how those lives were lost. Like, I don't think anyone would try to justify outright genocide of innocent civilians, you know, for the sake of empire. But if you're trying to establish civilization and you have a bunch of like say if you're the Boers, you're trying to deal with the Zulus, and you know, how are you going to be able to pacify these people when their entire tradition is one of conquest and subjugation of other peoples? You know, how do you interact with them in a way that causes the least amount of bloodshed, knowing that you're going to get hostility and aggression on their side as well?
Yeah. You know, I think one of the more difficult questions that sort of emerged through the debate is the person who advocates empire dealing with the question of someone who's a strict anarchist and views all forms of political society as an extended, thinly veiled mafia. And you mentioned that a couple times, Keith. And what the imperialist or even someone who advocates a state is going to have to do is differentiate, okay, well, in some non-trivial way, how a mafia is different than a state or an empire. And to be honest, at least in the modern context, we don't see a lot of that. In the classical period, in the medieval period, we did. I mean, Augustine in his pirate dialogue in The City of God makes a distinction between the state serving the good and a state serving its own selfish interests. Aristotle makes a similar distinction. But in the modern age, nobody really makes that distinction. So it leaves the imperialists somewhat vulnerable in that regard, because how would you answer it if good and evil aren't factors? It's just a matter of power. Then maybe it is just a gang. And so that's one thing that the modern imperialist, I think, has a hard time generally answering. So I guess what are some of your thoughts on what's been discussed, Keith?
Well, yeah, I think that really the point you just raised is a big part of it, in the sense that obviously to defend imperialism, you have to be able to defend the state in the first place. Now, you can certainly defend the state without defending imperialism. That is a separate question. But it's certainly true. I don't know of a single historical example of an empire that really didn't function as a type of mafia organization. Now, there are some states you can argue where, well, they were, you know, benevolent states or something like that. I think it's more plausible to make an argument like that. But when it comes to states that are about conquest of other states and subjugation of other states, the idea that organizations like that are somehow separate from criminal organizations seems a bit dubious. So that's a really serious problem that I think any defender of imperialism is going to have to address. Now, there are plenty of defenders of imperialism who simply make lesser of the evils arguments. Neil Ferguson is a good example. He basically says, well, you know, the British Empire wasn't all that bad. We brought civilization to, you know, Africa or India or whatever. I think he certainly waters down the cost of all of that, but he does make that argument. It is an actual argument. And I've generally heard that as being one of the most frequently offered arguments for people from people who do defend empires. The idea that it's better than the alternative, because what's the alternative? For example, the neocons, they will defend empires by saying, well, If we don't have a single hegemon imposing order on the world, that then we're just going to have constant wars between nations, and not only that, but that trade will be disruptive, and that's bad for the world economy and things like that. I mean, it's really just sort of a lesser of the evils argument.
Yeah, and that I think that was sort of the main tack that I was taking in my debate.
Mm-hmm.
But I see that you joined Logos. So I guess we were just going through what people thought were the strong points of each side, the weak points of each side. So maybe you could break down where you thought Keith and I were weakest, where you thought we were strongest.
Oh, sure. Hi, everybody. I thought you both were strongest on history. I thought that listening to this debate as I was moderating it was like two juggernauts well studied in history just kind of like going at each other like, Godzilla versus somebody else, wrecking Tokyo. What I thought was strongest on Todd's side was I like how he took the historical facts and built kind of like a narrative or structure out of them, and made this like impenetrable idea of, if not empire, what else are you going to have? And we have to consider that question carefully, because when empires fell, historically, here's what happened, and it was, usually very bad things. I thought it was pretty evidentiary. What I liked most from Keith's side was when he brought up some of the epistemic questions, like with his example of the Huns, when you're getting invaded by somebody, and you think, and they claim, let's say, that they're going to start up an empire. How do you know if they're going to conquer you, annex you, and start up an empire that'll make you safe and economically flourish? Or how do you know if they're just going to like raid and pillage you like the Huns or the Vikings or somebody else? So it seems to be that he made a good case based on that a lot of this discussion of empire is post hoc discussion. It's kind of like, well, the empire has already started, it's already here, and so what we're really doing is just analyzing whether or not we accept the status quo. So it's not, you can't really defend the empire from the present to the future, but only from the present to the past, or from the present going forward to the future if an empire already exists. And I've been thinking about that for quite a while after I listened to the debate. I thought that was a really, really good rebuttal. I think where each side was weakest, maybe. I don't know if Todd could, in his position, look at the cost in terms of the humanizing emotional element in which the left likes to argue against empires. Because if you're making the conservative argument of security and like the firm hand and like, this is how the world has to be, well, if the other side's able to circumvent that argument with the emotional case, it's like, look at the blood, look at the toil, and they completely argue against you on a completely separate dimension. That's someplace you're necessarily going to be weak because of the position you've kind of taken up and reinforced, given the limited time you have to speak in the debate. I thought Keith did a good job of coming at it from that angle, and that was where one of Todd's weaknesses was. But I don't think it's like he made the argument weakly. I think that's just a necessary trade-off in the position he chose to argue. I thought the place that Keith might have been weakest was the what's the alternative argument is a really, really strong argument, as Keith was noting as I joined and before I started. And I don't know if the audience can necessarily believe that a spontaneous order will pop out of a lack of empire, and that something will necessarily fill it. So I think where the biggest challenges of the against empire side is to really cobble together some historical facts and say, hey, there's some kind of an institution we could build that negates the bad things of the empire, but does the good things we should all admit are good things. And here's what we should try to do going forward, like the positive change. Let's do this instead. I think that's just a necessary challenge on that side of the argument. I don't think that was a deficiency in Keith's argument necessarily. I think it's just a challenge for that side as a general practice.
So basically what you're saying, Logos, is that Keith and I were fairly evenly matched, but there were certain aspects of what we were defending that would be difficult for anybody to defend. It's like when I said in other cases, really smart people can still lose if they're defending weak positions.
Right, exactly.
I mean, not yet. So it's more like that, right? We were somehow conditioned by the position we were defending, and that left us maybe not, putting the best foot forward in certain cases.
Sure. Every position has weak points. You just got to figure out how to attack them.
Or avoid them if you're defending it.
Right.
So I guess, Anarcho, what do you think of Mediator's comment?
Well, I think that's fairly true. I mean, I kind of said this before. It's like, how much if if someone says that no amount, that even if we were to establish, like if we were trying to build an empire of liberty or peace or justice, is even one life worth that cost, especially, and let's say this is an innocent life in particular, because I don't think people would mind too much if you're trying to build a civilization that tries to work for everyone, and then you have to kill thousands of savages just want to rape and murder and pillage everything. I don't think people mind too much if you have to go through them in order to get it. But the question is one innocent life worth all the prosperity that might come from your empire? And the thing about that is we'd have to exclude a lot of empires like the Romans and the Mongolians, where in the idea of an innocent life, I mean, they were far more tribalistic back then. They probably wouldn't care that much, for an innocent life versus a non-innocent life. So, but looking at more of the modern empires, the British and the Americans, that's a very important question. How many casualties are you willing to put up with in order to, and this is, of course, assuming that your empire has noble ambitions. You can, of course, critique the modern empires for that being just the face they use to promote what is essentially an economic agenda. But barring that, like what are you willing to sacrifice in order to build your empire is a good question. And if you're coming at it from a deontologist perspective, you would say that you can't put even one innocent life at risk just to make an empire. Whereas if you're more a consequentialist, not even necessarily moral consequentialist, if you're just someone who says, look, politics is very dirty, it's very messy, it's violent by its nature, state is the art of violence, whatever, then sometimes you would have to, but you have to ask yourself that fundamental question, what amount of human life is even one worth what it would take to build what you think would provide peace and prosperity for the long run?
Yeah. I got another question for Logos. So given that, given the time constraints we both had, and given that the opening statement, it was Keith and I just physically couldn't answer all of the questions that the one side asked. How do you think we did on prioritizing which questions to answer?
I think you did well, because you both looked at the limited time and said, I have to prioritize all the questions, and I'm going to do so by sticking to the ones that let me build a particular kind of argument. So Todd focused on answering, of all the questions asked of him, those which directly came into conflict with the security question and the what's the alternative question, and use those to put together, again, just reinforce that position and just, batter it through. And then Keith answered the questions that corresponded to the dimension he was arguing for, the cost of human lives and the exploitation of the empires, the abuses. And you didn't seem to go too far into each other's zones that you got like tangled up in the reeds. You kind of tried to separate them and argue in your own lane, so to speak, which is good, because each of your positions, I think, were weak in those opposing lanes. And so it forces the debate into kind of a stalemate where the audience has to make up their minds based on who drove through their point on the position their opponent was weakest.
So are you saying that Keith and I, when we chose to answer, we answered the most penetrating objections from the other side?
Not necessarily the most penetrating objections. I'm saying you answered the objections in such a way that you built a cohesive narrative out of your answers. So it's almost like, there's 10 questions coming at you, and it's like, well, I can answer 5 of them, and I can answer the 5 where all my answers will connect in such a way that it's reinforcing a more broad narrative I'm going to argue in the debate, such that, for you, there is no alternative built into my opponent's position, right? And you can't just get rid of empires and leave a vacuum and expect good things to happen. So I'm going to pick those 5 answers and answer them in such a way that will reinforce that point and drive it in further. And then Keith looked at his questions and said, well, out of all the ones that Todd asked me, I'm going to answer the ones that will, in my answers, let me reinforce my point about the abuses and inherent problems within empires generally, and drive into Todd from that point, because I know he's weak there.
Yeah, okay. So, Keith, what are some of your thoughts on Anarcho and Logos' observations?
Yeah, well, I don't really disagree with anything that's been said. You know, my strategy, so to speak, in this debate was to start off by simply anticipating the opposing arguments. You know, like in the opening statement I made, I more or less, my opening statement was more or less just going through the list of common arguments in favor of empires and pointing out what I think is wrong with those. I think that that's a good way to approach a debate, in the sense that if you can anticipate your opponent's arguments and then knock those out of the water, or attempt to right out of the gate, then you kind of leave your opponent with not having a whole lot to go on, or else they're automatically on the defensive, and so then you can kind of get the upper hand that way, you know, right from the start. But I think substance, though, is really the question. You know, I was never really a huge fan of formal debate procedures, you know, where you've got the opening statement, rebuttal, and all of that, because I think too many of those, I mean, it's a legitimate process, but I also think too many of those that I've seen come across like pro wrestling matches, you know, where it's more about you win on presentation rather than on actual substance. So I think the substance has really got to be there for somebody to win a debate. You know, like I've seen debates where someone will say, well, so-and-so won, and they think that only because they're the best speaker or had the most polished style of delivery or whatever. But I tend to be more about the substance. And there was a lot of substance in this discussion. Yeah, I think you know, ultimately it comes down to the consequentialist arguments. You know, what are the consequences of an empire? If you're trying to sway someone's opinion, you know, I think that's really the best way to go. If you know, somebody who just says, well, moral objections to imperialism don't matter, or I just don't care about them, they're not going to be swayed by that. But somebody who can be made to understand that there are serious consequences for empire building might be inclined to take your position more seriously.
Yeah, I think we kind of covered all the main angles, unless there's any more observations anyone would like to bring up. So I guess if we've covered the observations, is there anything you guys want to leave us with?
It was really awesome to listen to. Yeah,
thanks. So the real question is, if Keith Preston and I were monsters destroying Tokyo, which one of us was Godzilla? Which one of us was Mothra? So yeah, I'll thank everybody for joining. Keith, thanks for participating. Logos, thanks for moderating. Anarcho, thanks for your feedback. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.